Okay, great. Well, thanks to everybody for coming in. We'll get started. So we're going to be talking about Scrum for Teams and really cross-disciplinary dive into what that means for our organizations, and that's what we're chatting about today. I'm Ray Velez. I'm the Global Chief Technology Officer at Razorfish. Been an old-timer there about close to 15 years. I recently published a book, also co-author of a book called Converge, Transforming Business at the Intersection of Marketing and Technology. And actually, we'll talk about some of the elements in there in the book, in the presentation today. You know, I'd like to jump in and get started. So, let's keep this very conversational. It's a small group. I'm only wearing a microphone for the video camera, as I hear. So feel free to ask questions as we go. I find asking questions contextually is really useful, and I think we have plenty of time in the presentation to do that. So feel free to interrupt me as we're going along. First off, I'm a proud certified Scrum Master. And so the team, we joked about that a lot in the team. I've been working with Agile technologies since the early days, before Scrum was even started, back with extreme programming and things of that nature. And it's been a very long journey, getting our organization and getting our enterprise clients to get comfortable with this concept. And one of the things that did help, I think the Scrum Alliance has been a big help. So their ability to have somebody to go take a course, to understand what it means and to drive the principles. And it's a little bit controversial. Like, not everybody was happy about a certification type of thing, at least in the Scrum circles. But we think it's made a big change. And it's been very helpful. And then over the last 2 years, and I'll talk about this more as we go through the presentation, it's been about 2 years since they introduced the Product Owner course, which was great for us as well. This is all, are folks familiar with the Scrum Alliance? ScrumAlliance.org, yeah. It was a great addition because the #1 challenge we found globally to having successful engagements at our clients was the lack of product ownership. So we would go through and we'd drive you know, to successful completion, but without a product owner that has helped us make the right trade-offs, it's always been a challenge. And you could always proxy that, right? And as a consulting company, you could be that product owner, but then it's largely a disconnect between requirements and where they want to take the product. And so at Razorfish, we create experiences that build businesses. And what we mean by that, it's really software development. And that's what we've been doing is whether it's a mobile application, a web application, et cetera. And the challenge we've always had, and this is part of the reason for the conversation today, is that cross-disciplinary nature. So we sit in between the traditional creative user experience and advertising organizations, and as well as the more traditional technology consultants. And my background, I used to work at a place called Cambridge Technology Partners. I was there for about 10 years as a software developer. But I got tired of building software that no one would ever use. You know, we were really good at it. And I always tell this anecdote. One of my first projects was a data warehouse for Unilever. And the chemical buyers at Unilever were trying to find a better way to resource zeolites. I think it was called zeolites. But it was the materials that foam up, the stuff that's really bad for the earth, basically. But you know, we went through, we built this. We built it on time, on spec, delivered it, you know, worked a couple difficult weeks and weekends, got it done on time, received a little CTP award. And then about 6 months later, Bill, the client, who I handed off the project to, he calls me up and he's like, "Hey Ray, I need to figure out how to, you know, do a compile and do this, and how do I check the log file?" And I'm like, "Well, people are using this every day. You should know these things. Does anybody? Why are you asking these very basic questions?" Like, nobody uses this, right? And so I thought there was this epiphany. We got an award, we did it, we got it all done on time, but we didn't bring in the disciplines that understood the user, right? We didn't bring in the people to bring all that together, that cross-disciplinary aspect to make the software we build successful. So we can get it done on time and on spec, but without a real focus of understanding all of the needs that go into the software we're building, you're not going to get anywhere. And that's what Razorfish is, and just tons and tons of skills. And I only see more skills and more cross disciplines coming into the the mix as the industry grows. There's a great article from Forrester, developing the next generation predictive applications. They came out with it about a month or two ago, and I started sharing it with our teams internally. And if you think about all of the big data processing it's made available to us, all of the insights we have on people's usage patterns, whether we're anonymously tracking people, whether we're using web analytics to track people specifically, and then you bring all of that together, there's an enormous amount of information that I can use to apply to the way I design and build software. And they're recognizing this. This is the trend. We have lots of analytics. We have lots of understanding. The Google Now type of things, right? Like Google Now looks at my calendar and tells me, well, in order to make this meeting on time, you have to leave now, right? So these predictive types of things. And so we have data scientists on our team that help us understand the data pieces. We have creative user experience. And this article said now we have to add psychologists to our team. So a whole new set of skill sets to help us achieve our software goals and to leverage the next generations of technology, right? If machine learning and big data wasn't making data approachable in a way that we could actually use it to create predictive and data-driven experiences, then we wouldn't need these skills. But technology keeps lowering the barrier to entry, making it much easier for us to do things that we've never done before, but it needs a whole new set of disciplines. And if we're just the software developers in the room building that, we're going to build stuff that nobody uses, and that's certainly not what we want out of our goals. And then I've been talking about Agile for a long time in my organization, and there were some dark days. Moving from waterfall to Agile wasn't going very well, and I remember it was about 6-7 years ago. I had my year-end review, and my boss, who I was co-author with him on this, back to Rob's point, he was delivering me some difficult feedback, and he said, stop talking about Agile, Ray. No one wants to use this. Our clients aren't embracing it. Just give up the cause. And I was pretty demoralized. And literally within about 7 days, we had 3 new RFPs come in, and each one of them required that we would bring Agile expertise to the table. So it was a bit of a tipping point, right? And when you think about the Agile Manifesto, what was it signed about 13 years ago? So this whole movement for a different way of building software, it's still, 13 years isn't that long, right? And this was, 5 or 6 years into it. And then now I think it's the majority of the way we do business. But I still think there's so much more that we can do to help execute better with an Agile iterative approach. And that's what I'll be talking about. But now that there's been some good momentum, everyone wants to talk Agile. So there's Agile commerce, right? So it's taking over every aspect of the enterprise. And Agile is kind of a good word, right? Because everybody wants to deliver things better and faster. So that's a part of that's a bit behind this too. But I think there's some more meat. So Brian Walker at Forrester, he's now at Hybris, first created the Agile commerce perspective, which is understanding that your commerce experience, your retailers, they don't move in a linear flow anymore. They don't go from, hey, I'm interested, I saw a commercial, I want to buy it, I'm going to consider it, and then I'm going to go buy it. That's not how it works anymore, and digital has given consumers power, right? So when I'm in a physical retail store, I could check other prices. I can bring up my mobile app. I can buy the book on Amazon instead of buying it in your store. So this changed this whole world of commerce. And then Agile marketing, which I thought this was really interesting. They've actually created their own manifesto, right? So a little bit like, I don't think the gang of 4+ who created the first manifesto, and I don't know why I was in Salt Lake City, Utah 13, 14 years ago. They had their 4 key principles, right? People over process, working software over documentation, et cetera, et cetera. And here, this is from the Agile Marketing Manifesto site. They've aligned a lot of the same types of things. And if you think about just like technology transforming the way we build software, technology is transforming the way marketing organizations communicate with their customers. And so I love these 4 because they do align really well. People over process is a little bit like customer-focused collaboration. Validated learning is like software, working software over documentation. Adapting and using data to inform your process. and then using customer discovery over static prediction. And so you can see, I'll talk a little bit about The Lean Startup. It's a great book by Eric Ries, where he talks about how organizations, when you're building your next set of features, decide not only what is the test data for your software components, what are the unit tests, but what are the business and customer validated tests that are the output of your features, right? And so that it's a great example of that. And so again, every aspect of large enterprise organizations today are changing the way they do business. And Agile's a key element of all of them. And Agile creativity is a little bit from the Google world, where they're trying to help creative teams understand that, well, if you want to use the powerful world of Google tools, everything from not just their display advertising and search advertising, but their YouTube platforms and their other platforms, you have to change the way you build creative. And that's a lot of what I've been trying to do, is to help our creative and experience teams align more with an agile and iterative approach, so that we still want some of that friction when you have different disciplines in there, because we believe that's how innovation bubbles up. But we think we could be much more efficient and get to market much faster. And once you get to market, that's when you actually validate whether your software is going to get adopted or if it's going to fail. So what we've done to help do this is we built just a half-day course, and it's a very hands-on course. So we have some pre-work before you start the course, and the pre-work is essentially the Scrum principles. Get some, and it's an online course where you go through, you watch the video and you answer questions, but you get the very basics. What are the core mechanics to drive a successful Scrum engagement, right? So it's a sprint retrospective, it's sprint planning, it's backlog grooming, it's planning poker, all of those core fundamentals, and some that, some are more controversial than other. We have anecdotally seen Scrum to be a more popular flavor because it's more digestible by large enterprises. Things like extreme programming principles, if you go way back, like pair programming, like Rob was talking about, and others, I still find that to really scare most enterprise organizations, to the point where it's tough to get past it. And so the Scrum Alliance and the Scrum principles work really well for large organizations. And the feedback we get when our clients go through this half-day course is it's outstanding. Every time we've given the course, it's worked really well. And that's because I think it's less about somebody talking to the organization and more about, we ask the leadership and all of the different disciplines to go through a couple of sprints together. So it's more of a workshop than a learning course, and what you're getting out of it is hands-on experience and a deeper understanding of, wow, what I really need to get good at is prioritization of features. What I really need to get good at is learning from my previous iteration, so that I could estimate better for the next iteration. And so that's really what we help to engender in our teams. And nobody goes through the pre-work. The other thing we talk about in the course, and what we talk about as an organization, is we think Agile is actually a really powerful way when you have a diverse team, right? So you have different skill sets, but also when I have people sitting in different seats. And so we have a global team. We're about 21 different offices. We try to align our offshore and nearshore teams as close as possible from a time zone perspective. And whether you can do that, like our team in London works a lot with Eastern Europe. In the US, we work a lot with Latin America, and it just makes a huge difference. So I could still have my daily stand-up meeting. I could still have that real-time interaction that you get with an Agile approach, and then that also get the cost. And really what's very important at this point is the scale efficiencies. It's so hard to find good talent in just one space. How do you scale your team so that you could pull from any location, whether regardless of the closest time zone? And what we have found, which was a little bit counterintuitive in the beginning, is that Agile actually works a lot better, right? Because the traditional thinking was, well, if you're going to do something offshore, you better have very detailed documentation so that your specifications are very well understood. Then ship it off and then wait till it comes back. But we found that that doesn't work for a variety of reasons, right? Doesn't meet the business goals, and business changes, right? You know, we want to build software that changes based on how people use it. If I'm shipping something off and waiting it to come back, it can't change. And so this changes that mindset, changes the mindset to using living, breathing documentation, wiki-based documentations, things of that nature. And it's been very successful for us. And at the end of the day, we're not building documents, right? We're building experiences. We think it's critical you still have documentation. We don't think that goes away. But we think you need to use a modern approach. You need to use wiki-based documentation. You need to drive the documentation aligned with what you're actually building as opposed to what you're just hoping to build. And that's because business requirements change, conditions change. One of the first Agile projects we did was for years and years ago, was for Ford Motor Company. It's been a client at Razorfish for about 8-9 years. It took me about 3 months to get buy-in and comfort, right? Like a large organization like Ford still believes that the only way to build software is with a waterfall-driven approach. And I still think they, to a large extent, most of the organization still believes that. But after about 3 months, we were able to get them comfortable with a more agile iterative approach. Plus, it showed that we believed we could deliver faster. And I think the dirty little secret, which we don't always say, I think we deliver things faster with Agile is because we don't build everything. We find out what we need to build and what is acceptable for the user, and then that's what enables us to launch earlier, and that's because most of the functionality that gets designed is rarely or never used anyway. And so when you use data to help prove those points, then you can then launch earlier. But the key finding we had is it was right at the time, I guess it was around 2007, 2008, where over the summer in the States, everybody's worried about gas prices. And then we hit the credit crisis, and then everybody was worried about holding on to their car longer. So we were building the Ford owner site experience, and we were able to shift from a whole bunch of gas-saving techniques and features on the site to helping people understand how to get into an extended warranty and how to keep their car longer. So the business conditions changed, which tangibly had an impact on our feature backlog, which only an Agile iterative team would have been able to make that shift. And there were actually, when we started the owner redesign and the rebuild, there was our pitch, which was this Agile iterative approach, and then the internal team said, no, we're going to do it traditional, and it's going to take us 8 to 9 months. And so we were able to shift our process in the middle, which that traditional team would have had to start over, taking the waterfall-based approach. So it was a really great proof point. It was a big success story. But the point is, not only am I learning how to create better estimates and write better software and learn how this new architecture works, but I'm also giving the product owners that latitude to enable the business requirements to change. And I think one of the biggest ones, too, is that we ask our clients to make decisions based on, at best, a prototype, but most of the time it's a wireframe or a set of designs that they're deciding what the functionality should be and what it should work like. And once you get to Agile iterative working software, you can then drive a much more real-time exchange of, okay, which features are getting used and which ones aren't. We talked a little bit about this, but at this point, we have found it to be essential for when we have a distributed team. And I think at Razorfish, what has happened to us over the last 4 or 5 years is that it's not just offshore. We have people across all of our different offices, and we have global teams. Our clients are asking us to do more and more global work, and I think it's just the nature of large enterprise organizations today. We do a lot of work for Mercedes, and the big statistic that really stuck in our minds last year was they sold more cars in China than they did in the US last year. And so there's still a lot that they want to do as a brand globally. They want to drive this consistent look and feel and feature set, but they understand that it has to be done on a global scale. And that's changing the way we do things. And so this distributed approach and Agile has been hugely important for us. And there's even simple things that come out. You know, I worked on a startup a couple years ago, and we had a big team in Argentina and a large team in New York. And the number one thing that came out of our first retrospective is we need better phone lines. We need better video conferencing. So even those simple things had a massive impact on the product, and you just don't get that in a more traditional waterfall style approach. So it seems, you know, I still debate it a lot with a lot of our enterprise clients, and organizations still don't get it. They're still struggling with this. And there's a variety of reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons is this grew out of software. And we don't build software as much as technologists, you know, like to joke about being the guys in the back of the room writing code. That's not how it works anymore. So for an Agile project to be successful, the rest of the organization has to align with this process. It can't just be the Agile team that runs an iterative approach and backlog grooming. It has to be the rest of the organization. Sorry. So there's a couple things we've done over the years. One of the biggest learnings we've had is folks would add a daily stand-up meeting to their traditional waterfall approach, and they would say, okay, I'm Agile now, right? And then that project failed when I had a daily stand-up meeting. So I just proved that Agile doesn't work, right? So that was very, very common and something we heard very often. So what we did is we came up with a list of questions that we could go through and talk to teams. And this was just as important for our internal teams as teams or experiences that our clients had, and said, well, let's talk about where you fit on this adoption scale, right? So try to you know, diffuse a little bit of the, for some reason it feels like there's a lot of passion around the traditional approach versus Agile approach. So we said, okay, well let's diffuse that. I'm not going to say, oh, you did this right and you did this wrong, but you know, there is a maturity index. So yes, maybe you had a daily stand-up meeting, and so and you layered that on top of all your other annoying meetings as part of your traditional approach. But did you do any backlog grooming? Or how are you tracking your velocity? Are you tracking your burn down rate? And until you start doing more of those things, you don't get to the mature Agile organization. So it immediately diffuses that point where people say, well, I'm doing a daily stand-up meeting. Isn't that enough to make my projects go better? Well, that means you're immature. You're doing something, and you're probably getting benefits from it. But in order to actually improve your delivery of software, you need to move up the maturity scale. And that's been really, really helpful when we're in when we're in these conversations. This is from version 1's Agile survey, and there's a bunch of things, but there's still, this is relatively recent over the last couple of years, there's still a lot of that general resistance to change, and I think the workshop helps us get over that. There's still a lot of inability to change culture. So a good example of that is we've been doing a lot of work with Delta. We helped rebuild the latest iteration of their site, delta.com, the latest redesign. And when we started it about 3 years ago, it fell within the e-commerce organization at Delta, reports up through the marketing team. And so he had a series of marketing managers, our client who was leading the redesign. And the first thing he did, and this was incredibly exciting, and I think this goes to the culture change, is he changed their titles. So they were marketing managers that became product managers and helped instill some of that product owner mindset. So it started changing so it started to become part of their job to actually prioritize features on an ongoing basis. And then the other part is the really tough part to learn. If you're a product owner who doesn't have technology understanding, well then how do you prioritize technology debt, right? Because I think most good Scrum teams do a great job of, like, I have some refactoring that needs to happen. How do I convert that into a story and put it onto the backlog? But then if you're the product owner who doesn't have an understanding of software, how do you prioritize when you're at that critical point where you need to raise the priority of technical debt stories alongside with feature stories? And so that product owner mindset gives us that opportunity to help change that culture within the organization, so that it's not just the technology team prioritizing the technology refactoring tech debt stories, and then the marketing team refactoring theirs. There's one person who does it and makes those very, very difficult decisions. And so that's a big one. And what it showed was our client, Bob Cuppins, had that manager support, and he made the culture change by changing titles from marketing to product owner. So what needs to change? So we've talked about some of this as we've been going through this. But there's a lot of things that have to change within an organization. And I think that's why it's important that this really grew out of the software world, this agile iterative approach. And that's why us as architects, as technology leaders within organizations, we have to help the rest of the organization along. That's what I realized, about 10 years ago, is that the only way out of this really difficult software development lifecycle is to help the whole organization change. And it's not going to come from anywhere else in the organization. That's just the reality. I've led the tech group at Razorfish for a long time, and we have an annual technology summit where we get all the tech teams together. And the number one concern, and it has gotten better since we've moved to a lot more agile and iterative development, has been that the stories that Rob was talking about this morning, right? So the inability to treat estimates as estimates, the inability to build quality software, or the last minute changes that burn the team out and encourage people to quit. That number one, so as long as I've been in the industry, I think it's an important realization to make. And we see agile and iterative approaches as a way out of that, right? We treat an estimate as an estimate, and every iteration, our estimates get better. They track back to our velocity, they track back to our stories, and we get better at being able to deliver on time, and thus helping the business to make their priorities. But that has to come from the software group, and that means adding new people skills, but what it also means is that we need to figure out how to help change our organizations. And it's a big ask, but it's the only way it's going to get solved. And so if you go through a Scrum Master course, people will talk about roles. You'll talk about, okay, there's roles around quality, there's roles around testing, there's roles around software engineers, but never will it mention a marketing manager, or never will it mention a business manager, or never will it mention a creative or user experience lead. Like, it's not been there yet, and it's starting to get there. That's why I was so encouraged. The Scrum Alliance is such a great learning organization. They added a product owner course because Agile was failing because there were no product owners, and there was lack of a skill set. Product owner became, to some degree, a unicorn in the industry. So, but when you're at an organization like Razorfish, where you have such great talent with creative and user experience, then you need to figure out how to bring them into the process as well. So it has to go beyond that. It has to go beyond solving just software development to including all of the roles within your organization. I'll talk a little bit about that. So all of this, as I went through and I've worked in the feedback from our Agile practice at Razorfish and the work we do with our clients, a lot of the books that have influenced me, and I'll list all the books at the end. There's been a bunch of great books. One of the ones, especially with Q's and some of the others, there's Scaling Lean and Agile is a great book. Has anyone read Craig Larmer and Boss Vode's book? It's really dense, and it's academic, kind of hard to get through, but it's fantastic. A lot of those ideas have influenced the way I look at how we can adapt our organizations, change the way we build software. And I'll show a picture at the end with all these, and I'll probably get the slides up on SlideShare too. But the 5 key principles, going back to keeping teams small and scaling them, and then the question becomes, well, then how do you scale, right? So everybody agrees, oh, Amazon says you need a 2-pizza team, so I agree too. Every time my project team gets over 15 people, things start to go off track. Well, but then how do I scale that to a large enterprise? And there's no answer there, and I think Scaling Lean and Agile's talked a lot about that. Test and test. So not just your unit tests, but what's my feature test, my software test, my user test. Small batches, obviously iterations, and talking about the power of small batches. There's a great example to help make that clear. I'll go through the envelope problem. Eliminating queues, and I think queuing theory really goes back to manufacturing and then how that applies to the software development world. And then I'll talk a little bit about software. I wanted to bring in a little bit of that. And I think actually I heard the question earlier this morning too, is how do you using DevOps and cloud technologies, that was one of the big areas where software would create a queue, even with an agile and iterative approach. And I just think there's some amazing innovation starting to happen there. So keeping your team small. And I love this. This is the Standish Group has been, I wish there were more organizations that did studies like this, but the Standish Group has always been a group that I go back to on how to do software better. And I haven't met many organizations that do as much research as they do on understanding this. The other quote I always throw out from some of their studies is that 64% of the features you build are rarely or never used. And every time I do that, the creative and user experience leaders, they look like their eyes are like burning into, they want to kill me whenever I say that. But it's been our experience. That's just the reality, is that most of what you design doesn't get used. And I love being able to spout statistics that are not my opinion, which is great. But so I took a client through this, large airline client. And they were embarking on a project, and we were talking about how to make it smaller. And like, no, this is, we already set the budget aside. The executive team set the budget aside for the software project, and it was, a factor larger than $10 million. And I said, well, but this isn't that old. This is 2010, right? We've been building software for a long time. You have 0% chance of success. Why don't we figure out a way to make the project smaller, right? You can't. You're not going to be. And he wasn't. He was 12 months late, and his job was moved out of that organization to somewhere else. But I said, why? Why do we continue to try to do that? We know I can't get it done, right? And the Standish Group measures everything like the golden triangle Rob showed. Does it meet the requirements? Is it on time, and is it on budget? 3 simple questions. And for a project over $10 million, you have 0% chance of meeting that. And so keep this slide, use it in your conversation. It didn't work in that one. And it didn't help that, we went back later, we're like, well, you were 12 months late and millions of dollars late. It didn't help, but at least I felt better. And I do love this quote, right? Everybody always tries to say Amazon and Facebook and a lot of these innovative startup software organizations, oh, they're different, they're not like us. But yeah, no, they are like us, and they're really good at building software. Facebook and Google and Amazon and Microsoft, and they all use a lot of very similar techniques. At Razorfish, we were part of Microsoft for a couple of years, and it was great. I loved being part of it. I learned so many insights, and they build everything in an agile and iterative approach. They drive towards a team size like this as well, and they're building, some of the biggest platforms in the world. But back to the example I was talking about with that large airline, he said, my project needs over 100 people, Ray. Can you get me 100 developers tomorrow? And I said, if I did, it would fail. Why do you want to do that? And then there's, this is an old school book, but in the Mythical Man Month, he really lays out scientifically, why is this a problem? Why do we have to keep our team sizes small? Well, because scaling is really hard. So you have 2 people, you have 1 connection, but then you have 3 people, you have 3 connections. But then all of a sudden, as the team starts to get larger, you can't see the yellow. So you have 4 people, 6 connections. But as the teams start to get larger and larger, the number of connections grow, and it gets more and more difficult to keep everyone aligned and understanding where the changes are coming. So the larger and larger you build it, you see that you have 11 people and 55 connections. So there's just no way that can happen. The larger the team gets, the much more difficult it is to keep the team aligned and moving towards a common goal or common feature sets. And that's why one of the key principles is to keep your team size, 2 pizzas is enough to feed my whole team. How do I keep my size there? And then you have to that allows you, so you keep these multiple sprint team concept, and that helps, right? So, okay, you need a 100-person project. Well, let's try to break that down into smaller sizes, right? So what can I do? I can have multiple sprint teams, but then I also need to understand I have these external teams too, creative and experience. Maybe they're not part of our core teams. You know, really high-performing startups, and I like a lot of the the smaller organizations, startups like Etsy and others. They have all of the skills within their team. They have creative and experience. Everybody, developers are all utility players. And what that means is anytime one of the team members wants to pick a story off the backlog, anybody could do that, right? I don't know if anybody's run into this challenge that I've often seen is you have a backlog, you're doing sprint planning, but only 2 of the 10 people on your team can make database changes, or only 3 of the 10 people on your team can make presentation layer development changes. So we still haven't figured out how to solve that. I do think people can be trained and learn different skills, and we need to drive to more cross-functional skills, but we still have a little bit of this divide, so it gets difficult. Yeah?
When you've got multiple sprint teams, how do you deal with the backlog? Do you manage one backlog with one product owner for multiple sprint teams, and
Yeah.
assign those stories out that way to actually divide the backlog out so that the teams have their own?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, see, these are the questions that never come up, right? And it's easier to think about Agile with one sprint team, and it's much harder to think about it with larger. So I stole these graphics from the book I mentioned earlier, Scaling Lean and Agile Development. And so there's a couple things there. When you have a team, less than 10 sprint teams, you have one product owner, and then each one of the teams can have a sprint backlog, okay? But I think, and this is a highly debatable point, but that is one backlog, okay? So this product owner is constantly throughout every one of the sprint iterations going through and doing the backlog grooming, adding new requirements, after a sprint retrospective, change the priorities, right? Okay, this sprint told us that for us to build this one particular feature takes 10 times as long, and you have 600 of those on the top priority of the backlog. Do you want to change priorities based on that difficulty? That has to happen, but it only works for less than 10 teams. And then, okay, back to that airline example I had earlier, well, what do I do when I have more than 10 teams? And so what you have is you still have an Uber product owner, but then within each one of those 10 teams, there's this concept of an area backlog. And what you could see start to happen, back to the airline example, maybe this is ticketing, maybe this is seating, right? So you start to build backlogs. And I think the really, really important point around your product backlogs is understanding where they're focused, right? So that product backlog is a set of features. And I think the tech and other organizations are very guilty of building things that are not customer facing. So a lot of organizations we'll start working with, they're like, well, that's our CMS that's our content management system backlog, or that's our ERP backlog. Or airlines, I see this all the time. There's 2 guys who can make changes to Amadeus, the back-end ticketing system. And you know, like Rob gave that example, God forbid they go on vacation. But that team should be the ticketing team, not the Amadeus team. And there should be more. You should be comfortable training anybody in any of these locations to make changes. So it happens with data. It happens with content management system. It happens, search is an example I've seen tons of times. I see it a lot with content management. I have a 10-person sprint team, but only 2 people can make changes to the day CQ product or the Sitecore engine. And then if there's what you'll start to see is the product owner is prioritizing. He doesn't care that your sprint team only has 2 people who know how to change the CMS. And so the next iteration, all the backlog story priority is all CMS, but I can't make that change. So you need two ways to get out of that situation. One is you need to get comfortable letting people get trained, right? And letting people take more time to complete a story than the CMS expert would, right? And that's painful, but that has to happen. And then you also have to make sure you never have a backlog that's called my ERP backlog or my CMS backlog. Because at that point, you're getting further and further away from what's important to the business and what's important to the customer. So I combined 2 books there, right? But that's the learnings I had from Scaling Lean and Agile. And then the other book I combined is The Lean Startup from Eric Ries, right? So if you really want your cross-disciplinary teams, you have to make those changes. And that's important. But that's a great question. But I didn't win this argument. And that's why that large airline decided to do it their own way. But, so we talk about what's missing. And again, this is challenging ourselves on what we mean by cross-functional. Can my developers be designers? And if not, then how do I segment my backlog? How do I run my projects? And so again, you go through any of the Scrum training courses, and you might have a QA and a tester, but these are the only 2 people that talked about in the training courses. Thank God we've recently added product owner. But there's never any discussion here. So the user interface team, the creative and the user experience, and organizations like Razorfish, we actually split these 2 as well. So we have people who do the visual and the identity and the specialists, and then we have specialists who do the wireframes and the page and the site design. So if I split all of these skills, how do I keep pace? And I don't want these guys, right? There's that 64% that rarely or never gets used. I don't want these guys to go off and design the whole site. And this is where I continue to work with our teams to figure out a way out of that. But you need to get to the point where I'm going to design the experience, I'm going to design the pages, but I'll only design enough that I'm comfortable. I won't come up with a disjointed experience. But I don't want them to spend time and money designing that 64% that's rarely or never used. And they do. They want to do that because that's fun for them, right? It's like just dreaming. But that's really hurtful to the business. And the users aren't going to use these things. Why are you designing without getting testable feedback, right? Without using your sprint iterations. So we've come up with one approach. And to be honest, not all of our teams agree with the approach. I think we've successfully dismantled the fallacy that you don't design with Agile. No, there's a startup phase. I get enough of a design and an understanding of the whole architecture up front. And then what we do during design and development is, and both teams are working here, right? The creative and user experience and the technology teams are working here, the engineers and developers. But then what I ask the user experience teams to do is kind of during that sprint 0 or that spike time frame, depending on what terminology you use, is design just enough so that developers can then go through and estimate what the next sprint iteration is going to take, right? Yeah.
One question.
Yeah.
Your strategy and visioning phase,
Mm-hmm.
which is where your architecture will take place, how do you know that the architecture is right?
Right. So yeah, and it's funny. I posted on Facebook about with something similar, and everybody said, "Well, how do you keep the architecture in sync?" I haven't found, right. So because if you wanted to get the architecture right, you'd likely take this out longer. There's 2 techniques, right? And it's a rough heuristic. It takes experience to understand I've designed enough of the architecture to get started, and I don't need to design any more. And then the other approach is when there's something we're very concerned about, something that's very specific in the architecture that my experience doesn't tell me I have enough understanding, then it becomes a separate prototype, right? And so then what you would do is, how do I partition that sprint backlog, almost like I would partition the application, so that in parallel, I might do some prototyping to get more comfortable on a larger piece of the architecture, but get the team started on the pieces of the architecture that's not impacted by that. So the best approach I've seen is prototyping it out and figuring out what do I need to do to make sure that architecture is well enough defined. And then, that exact question, right? Finding that right heuristic point where I'm comfortable moving forward is the same thing that we're asking the creative and the user experience teams to do. It's like, okay, you can't go out and design the whole architecture. And even if you would, the business requirements are probably going to change here and here anyway. So your design's going to get tested. Your architecture is going to get tested. And so what we ask them to do then at that point is get to that heuristic where they're comfortable. There could be these other parallel proof of concepts for both the creative, the user experience, and technology architecture portions. But then what I would ask is then this team is designing just enough to keep the next sprint iteration backlog estimates and sprint planning session well enough informed, right? So that when I go into the planning poker session, I love planning poker. Not all of our teams use it, but it's one of my favorite. Does everybody know what planning poker is? Yeah, you hold up the little card. No. So planning poker is you're picking stories off the backlog, and you ask the whole development team to give a range of either story points or hours. It depends on if you're comfortable with story points or not. An estimate on how long that particular story and set of tasks with that story should take. And instead of asking the almighty on high architect to give out the estimates, like we used to do in the old days, I did that for years and years. Very nice sense of power, but you were almost always wrong. So what you do is you ask the whole team to vote on it. And you hold up a card, and now they even have these cool little mobile apps. I don't know if anybody's seen the mobile apps. And you have 3 or 4 different numbers, because you try to break down the tasks so that you know they're within a range of granularity, and everybody votes. Okay, that one's going to take 4, 8, 16, 32 plus hours. And usually if it's 32 plus hours, you have to break it down further. So then everybody holds up a vote, and if there's consensus, then you go with it. If there's a low and a high, you ask them to justify, and you come to agreement. But it builds such a massive sense of ownership. You know, the old world, right, where the architect on high pushed down all the estimates, there was no sense of ownership, and it was so easy and you know, understandable for the team that ended up having to write all the code that aligned with the almighty on high architect's estimates. Would say, well, no, those estimates were wrong. I didn't have any of that. So the team takes just huge ownership in that and driving towards that final sprint iteration. But in order to do planning poker well, the team has to be able to go into your sprint planning meeting with enough understanding from the creative and the user experience teams, and not letting the creative user experience teams design everything out there. And so it's a rough heuristic, and we usually don't get it right on a new sprint team until probably the 3rd or 4th sprint. So, you know, they may have done too much work that the sprint team, you know, can't keep up with, which is not a terrible thing. Or the terrible thing is where they haven't done enough design that the sprint team can't properly plan the next iteration. And so you usually takes 2 or 3 sprint iterations to get that right. And I think that's one of the great examples of why an agile iterative Scrum-based process is so much stronger than the traditional approach, because you do get the chance to get it right? With the traditional approach, if you got any of that wrong up front, there's no mechanism within a waterfall approach to actually fix your estimates, to fix the designs you got from your user experience team. There's nothing, there's no mechanism in it. You can do it, and you can inject those in there, but this just makes sure that it's a normal part of your process. And it's great. I mean, I really loved Rob's presentation this morning. You'll see that. These first couple of sprints, you're in that ravine. You're in that trough. Nobody's happy with each other. You never get agreement during sprint planning. There's, the UX team didn't think this through. They need a functional analyst now, right? And now I've introduced another role that's not part of the sprint team. And you run into all these things. But by the 3rd sprint, you get that fast learning curve, and then you're really moving quickly. So this is highly debated. I think it's the right approach, but to be honest, I still see this part of the industry evolving. I think the best approach is a fully cross-functional team, but finding, you know, roles that can write code, write visual, and write user experience, we just haven't, they feel like unicorns still at this point, right?
Out of interest as well, where does the analysis like come into this though? So say you've got a user story, and you don't understand exactly what needs to be done.
Right. Yeah.
That all come in before.
I've been. So what we've tried to do is ask our user experience teams to be the functional analysts, right? And I've been ignoring. I haven't mentioned the functional analyst term, and that's never worked. We tried that for 10 years. So what now? We have functional analysts who are also part of this team. So I think this should be UX and functional analysis. And those are the teams who are making sure that your done criteria for your stories is clear enough that once you get into sprint planning, the team knows what they do. And that's your test, right? So you're constantly testing this every iteration during your sprint planning session. So is there enough there that the tech team doesn't have open questions and concerns? And have we kept this team just the right busy enough in that previous creative, user experience, functional sprint, so they've defined enough of the backlog that we could do that. Because the belief is that the product owner can continue doing backlog grooming without the detailed estimates behind it, right? Or without the detailed functional and user experience. And sometimes you can do that, and sometimes the product owner needs more user experience to help do the prioritization. But that backlog grooming, I know I'm not supposed to say grooming in the UK, right? That's a bad term. That backlog management or hygiene, I should say, that is an ongoing process that's always happening. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it's,
what have you guys seen? Have you seen this type of thing?
It makes sense in terms of not, one of the things you mentioned about grooming is if those stories, if suddenly you get down the line, you decide those stories are useless and you've done loads of analysis in the first place, that's thrown away, so you don't
Yeah.
end up.
Right. Yeah, that's why you want to keep it in sync. Because the real test should be, and this is why I loved Eric's book, it should be here, right? When I launch and I look at it, and I don't want to let these guys to continue detailing out that functionality until I get my web analytics back, right? Until I understand whether anybody clicks on that feature or not. Because it's always been a struggle, because what happens is, say you get down to, you do 5 sprints, that's your epic, you launch and you go live. In the traditional world, that creative and experience team, they're gone. They've moved off the project and they're really done, or there's a small thin slice of it. And they have this stuff that they stood on and they forced you to launch, but they never learned that it didn't work. But the developer knows, right? The developer knows, oh, I built this advanced search feature, nobody's using it, I roll it out, I find that there's no feedback, I look at Omniture or Google and the analytics tell me no one's using it. But that creative and experience lead still thinks that was the greatest thing he ever designed. Right? And so that feedback loop isn't happening unless you're launching things iteratively, and you're launching them in smaller batches. So I'll talk about small batches next. So I think this is probably one of the most debated and difficult things we still haven't gotten right in the industry.
So in a world where you've actually got a fully cross-functional team, would you still advocate having a sort of team handbook, or is it just a case that some members of that team can be working on some design from one iteration, and then either the same people or other people on the team can pick it up next sprint to carry on with it? How does that?
Yeah, so I think, and that's where it's a bit of an uncomfortable answer, because you have that 2-pizza team, right? And so do these creative and user experience people, are they members of the 2-pizza team, or do they go off and get salads or something healthier? They're probably eating healthier. So they stand alone. And usually what we see is, and if I had to come up with a rough heuristic on how it maps, as your team size goes along, there's 3 or 4 creative user experience functional people to a development team of 10 or 11, right? And if I had a guess for an ideal size. And that's because they're not, these 11 technologists, engineers, they're not able to do this yet. You see it happen at small companies, right? Like some small startups are able to bring these 2 teams together. And it goes back to the point I was talking about earlier around the product backlog, is getting this team as cross-functional as possible. At some point, we might figure out how to make this a little bit more cross-functional, but it's not. And then I would contend that, in my experience, what I see is this still isn't cross-functional enough, too. Like, one thing I'd love to bring together more at our organization is our presentation layer engineers and our back-end engineers. And it's heresy. Like, people look at me as the old senile, CTO whenever I bring that up at my company. But there doesn't feel like any good reason why it's not separate. I mean, I get some of the drivers and some of the other elements, but what happens is we'll have our backlog, we'll have 3 guys who are presentation layer engineers, 7 who are back-end engineers, and 1 database engineer. And so not anyone can pick up each story from the backlog. Planning poker breaks down. All of that breaks down. And so there's more cross-functional capabilities that can be driven within the tech engineers themselves. And then once we solve that, or maybe in parallel to trying to solve that, it's also trying to drive some more of that cross-functional design capability too. To some degree, our presentation layer engineers do a little bit, a lot, I should say. If I said a little bit, they'd probably kill me. But those guys can do, they can do HTML, JavaScript, CSS, et cetera, but they can also do some of the creative and the user experience. But I think where we need to drive is towards more of bringing it all together. And like I always go to 37 Signals. They're an interesting group. They do a lot more of that. So the guys who write Basecamp and a couple of others, the guys who invented, David Hanmeyer has invented Ruby on Rails. There's some of that. You see examples in the industry, but not nearly enough.
Sorry, another question.
Yeah.
It's back to the planning and exploration.
Yeah.
It's really about the estimating up front, because
Yep.
inevitably the folks paying for the project have some idea of what it's going to cost and how long
Absolutely.
it's going to take.
Yeah. And so that still happens, right? You have to do that. And the approach we take is, and this is probably a factor of still of the old approach, is we'll do a more traditional waterfall style estimate, right, at the beginning, right? So we'll go through, come up with a waterfall based estimate in terms of number of people, time. And then the next step is, so we take that traditional estimate, and then we break it into epics. And so I don't know if you know what an epic is, but that set of sprints that end up in a final release. And then we also give the latitude, okay, these are estimates, so you might be able to launch a little earlier and you might be able to launch a little later. But this is, that's the approach. And it's the best guess estimate at that time, knowing what you do know, not having gone through and done all this other functional testing.
Ultimately, experience the finger in the air.
Yeah, exactly. But there's really, I think the problem was in the old world, and I remember doing this, one of my favorite, we built a life-critical call center for a company called Lifeline. They were these guys in the States that had this commercial that was famous, help, I've fallen, I can't get up. You push the little button and it dials into a call center. And we rebuilt the system. And so we were given, and this was more traditional, rational, unified process. So we had everything in our UML diagram. We estimated down to the methods and the calls into the methods, right? So like I was the architect, felt super comfortable that coming out of this estimate, I was 100% right. And I was probably, our team was about 60, 70, 80% wrong, right? And we went through the design, the analysis, right down to the method and the elements that would go into that method, spit it all out into a spreadsheet, and estimated a number of time for each method, right? So like way past just the finger in the air. And we still got it really wrong. And there was a couple of reasons why we got it wrong. One was they had this enormously complicated set of system. They had 12 different devices. When you push the button, it would call into the call center. The device would open up a communications channel. And they had dozens of different devices. So it had probably up to the top rail filled with these devices for testing and understanding. So that we thought we knew what best we could during design. And that once we got into development, we realized how little we knew about these boxes and the eccentricities that were undocumented and not part of it, right? And so I think that we came to the realization you could do the best, unified process, low-level designs you can, but you just can't get it right until you're starting to write the code. And that's, I think, where the religion comes into the argument between Agile and Waterfall, is that people are like, no, if I get my estimates right, I get my estimates right. But say we did get it right, the business changed their mind dozens of times throughout the process too, right? And the business is always going to do that because business conditions change, right? The top requirements change, and then as the business starts to use what you're building and they see what you're building, then they're going to want to change their mind too, right? They designed everything in Ether. Now they start to touch it and they're like, wait a minute, I said that, but I meant this, right? And with a traditional approach, you've wasted all the money, You've done all that design. And that design we did, that low level, putting the methods into the spreadsheet and estimating of it, that was a waste. But yeah, that's the debate.
How long do you see the foundation phase taking normally? I mean, I'm assuming that's to get all the environment set up, to get all the people recruited in, all of that. So obviously, the longer that takes, and some of that can take quite a while, you tend to lose the strategy, the vision changes.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, so there's a bit of a mix there. So I think it's good to talk about scaling factors. So like, what I have seen that would scale that foundation phase into larger or smaller, and then make you start to think about, well, how can I batch this into smaller chunks, is integration points, right? So the number of existing legacy systems and the number of connection points, right? Like, so what I should have known on that Lifeline project is that each one of those boxes were scaling the whole project. And it did, it scaled. Our design was 100% over time as well, because we misestimated it before we went into design. But I think that is probably the largest impact. So when I go through and estimate these two phases, the first question I have is, well, how many existing systems do I need to connect to? How many existing systems do I need to normalize data from? And that'll make it smaller or larger. And then at that point, that might be a good flag to figure out, well, how can I partition this and start thinking about scaling it in a better way? If there's larger than X number of existing systems and data that I need to get and normalize, then I better start thinking about how to make this scale a little better. Any other questions? So we talked about, how do we make it scale, which kind of fits right into that question. Understanding when you're on your less than 10 sprint teams. And the other point I didn't hit earlier is, right, you have that one product backlog. Make sure it has to be a customer-focused backlog. Figure out how to partition the different ones across the different sprint teams. But then it's how do I get that shippable product increment so that I could have that retrospective where the product owner can use that as input for their backlog. I'm going to start calling it backlog hygiene process, so that they keep this up to date. And so that's really where you have to have that sprint retrospective, and that and that's done as a joint team. And so the question then becomes, well, if I have 8 teams and each team is 10-person large, they'll have 80 people in that meeting. So you need to figure out the right heuristics there. And maybe it's the Scrum Master plus some sort of lead that's driving that. But that's a pretty important piece of the process. And then again, this is how you get larger and larger, and hopefully stay away from that $10 million one. Each one of those teams help keep that scary number away. So we talked a lot about the power of small batches, and we were talking about, well, I have a feature story, it has some of the elements from my creative, my user experience, my functional analysis team. Is it enough for my planning poker section, et cetera, et cetera? And the one thing that it starts to force the first couple of times you go through this is those first 3 sprints. Every time you get to a user story, you're breaking it into smaller and smaller chunks, right? So if everybody in planning poker votes 32 plus story points or hours or whatever it is, then that's a red flag. You don't have enough smaller batches. And if you don't believe in the power of small batches, there's this goofy problem, which we'll have a short quiz at the end of this right here. So let's see if everybody pays attention. I found this. It drew out of the Lean Startup blog, so Eric Rye's blog. He grabbed this to help understand it. And a lot of what you see in the Lean Startup is how these traditional manufacturing Kanban type of theories have influenced the way we build software. So what is the envelope stuffing problem? You start with a piece of paper, you fold it, you put it into an envelope. And there's 2 approaches, right? And in the one story where he talks about this, a person running the problem, he asked his kids, which way would you do this? How would you put this together? And I was embarrassed because I should have gotten this, but I looked at it slightly different. So there's batch and queue, and this is what his kid said. Well, go through, fold all the papers, stuff all the envelopes, seal all the envelopes. So if I have 100, fold 100, stuff 100 papers into envelopes and then seal 100 envelopes. So you do it in 3 pieces, batch and queue. And then there's the one-piece flow. I fold 1 paper, I stuff 1 envelope, seal 1 envelope, and then I keep repeating it. So show of hands, which one's faster, batch and queue? Or let's start, batch and queue. Who think batch and queue are faster? Okay. All right. And then who thinks one-piece flow? Okay, it's pretty much split. I thought, I thought for sure batch and queue would be the fastest. It's not. And this really helped me understand and grasp how we need to change the way we build software. And I have a video to prove it. This is on YouTube. I have the link, so when I put this up on SlideShare, you guys can see. This guy, he's a manufacturing engineer. And so my best friend's a manufacturing engineer, and he and I talked a lot since we were little kids. And so I see so much, and I think that's why so many of the leaders in the Agile Scrum methodology industry try to relate back to Toyota and manufacturing and things like that. But so this manufacturing engineer, he went through, he proved that one-piece flow is faster. And so still don't believe me. Somebody else took that video and analyzed it even deeper, right? So the average time to fold in a one-piece flow versus batch, average time to stuff, seal, stuff, et cetera. And bottom line is the one-piece flow or lean manufacturing is the faster way to get those envelopes sealed. But it was odd to me. Like, it really kind of stretched. Like, I knew breaking things into smaller batches, right? It took, but you know, the first couple sprints, it took me going through 2 or 3 sprints to start to realize this. And then your whole team gets better at it. Your whole sprint team realizes, wow, this story's too big, right? So your functional engineer writing your story, your creative and experienced teams building the inputs for your story, they start to change their thinking too. But I think the point of the envelope problem for me was it wasn't intuitive for everybody. This isn't something that people intuit. And it took real hard evidence and practice and a very boring video to really understand that one-piece flow is faster.
The other thing is, though, you fold all the paper first and then your time runs out, you've got 100%.
Yeah, no, that's great, right? The potentially shippable product argument. We bring that up a lot. And what's interesting about that is traditional software development was never done earlier. Like, just not, you were never ready to launch before your scheduled date. But with an agile and iterative process, you are. You can launch earlier. And the reason you can launch earlier is because the customer realizes they don't need 64% of that function. All those features, I don't need them all. And so the dirty secret of Agile and Scrum, which I don't tell new product owners, is you're going to launch faster, right? I guarantee we'll get it done faster. And I don't tell them it's because we're doing less, because they think it's a negotiation and they need to cram as much work out of you as possible. But that's the reality. You launch earlier because you launch with less because you don't need everything you're designing. Do you have a question? No.
Also, that you don't learn until you make a mistake until quite late into the process with that one. So it teaches you to make a mistake early.
Right.
If you fold 100 wrong,
Yep. Yeah.
then you've got to go back and redo that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do one now, then you've worked straight away.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. I mean, it was, I don't know why it surprised me, maybe because I'm a little hard-headed, but I looked at it and right away I was like, oh yeah, you fold them all first, then stuff the envelope. So it's definitely not the right approach. I'm only going to touch quickly on this, but I think, like we really, as engineers, we'll focus on architects. Let's get our unit tests done. Let's get test-driven design done first. But that's going to, it's going to be tough to be successful. Maybe I'll get working software, but I'll get working software that's no one's using, right? And that's just such a big reason. Again, it's 3 factors the Standish Group found, right? It's budget, it's time, and it's features, right? So building too many features causes things to fail, right? And that's, when you look at great software, it's got fewer features, and that's just the reality of the industry. And so in the Lean Startup, Eric talks a lot about defining, you have really a ladder of metrics. And I used to build a lot of data warehouses. And we would build metrics that would and actually the earlier example I gave, the Unilever example, we'd build metrics that were meaningful to the leadership team, right? I have a data warehouse, has a metric that the leadership team needs to track, like number of users hitting the site. And that's going to be difficult to be successful because the metric has to align with everyone in the organization. So when I built a data warehouse years later for Pepsi, what we did was we had metrics for the manager of all their operations factories. And Pepsi only has 3 factories for all of North America, which always amazes me. They had a factory in Mexico, a factory in Puerto Rico, and a factory in Ireland. And they mailed all of the Pepsi concentrate for all of North America, which is crazy. But so he had his metrics, and I said, well, you also need your metrics that need to cascade down to the manufacturing leader, right? So the leader within the plant owner, and then his metrics have to go all the way down to the guys who are filling the barrels. So we had 2 sets of metrics which were digital and would show up on the screen, right, and show up in PDFs or email. And then we actually had reports and metrics that we print out and we'd put at the filling station, right? Because the filling station guys, they didn't have a laptop with them and they weren't going to log in, but they needed a metric to target, so that would go all the way up. And that's really what he talks about in the Lean Startup. And then the nuance I would put on that is his metrics are laddering all the way back to the user. And you put those metrics in place before you go into your sprint iteration or your epic, because at that point, you know, this is what we're going to target. I'm going to launch it. And then if it's successful, I'll know immediately. And I won't build that 64% that never gets used. And so it's driving that virtuous cycle is a big change in the way organizations think. Especially what I find too a lot of times with the marketing organizations, they're very brand heavy. What I mean by brand is they're caring about impact and how people look at the experience and whether or not they feel that it has impacted the younger demographics' interest in their product, right? And so how do I translate that to a metric? But it has to be, and you're starting to see this shift. And you have to set that before you start. What is my goal before I start that project? And then go through, build the software and test it. And as long as you're staying close to small batch sizes and small iteration, you could keep yourself aligned. But it's a great book, and I think it's another example of why we need to be cross-disciplinary and need to drive that back through the entire organization. So the people I lean on at our organization, they're really data scientists, so consumer insight teams. And I ask them, well, what are those metrics, and how can you help us convince the clients to understand that and convince the product owner to set that goal and those posts ahead of our sprint iterations or our epics. And then cues, and this is really the biggest enemy of Agile, and we've talked about this a bit already, but what happens in your organizations is, like that airline example, you end up where there's only 2 people who can make changes to the ticketing system. And I like the airline example because I've seen it at 3 or 4 different airlines. And there's a ticketing system. A lot of them leverage a technology called Amadeus. So all the ticketing goes through that. And there's only 3 people who know how to make changes there. And they're really fast and they're really good at it. And they're the only people who've done it for the last 5 years. Then I create the structure like I showed earlier. I have 10 different sprint teams. And you end up 3 of those sprint teams can't launch because there's only 2 people that can make changes to Amadeus. So if you look at it, you've created a traffic jam. And there's no good reason for the traffic jam. There's an easy way out, which is I can train people. I can train more people to make changes at Amadeus. I know it's the ticketing system, and I know it's production, and I know cash flows through this, and it has to be of high quality, but it doesn't mean I can't have more people making high-quality changes to this system. And there's lots of great models on how that can happen. It doesn't have to be just one team, right? I can leverage the open source model. There are people who make kernel changes to the Linux operating system all the time, right? And it's not just Linus Torvalds making those changes. There's hundreds of people. And this is a mission-critical system, so you can do that. But you have to believe, and you have to look to identify those cues. And and Raymond talks a lot about this. The easiest way to think about it is traffic, and traffic patterns are really very similar. And so you have to, but with software it's malleable, and people can change that. And so there's a great way to help engender this from a leadership level so that you could help organizations believe and think about it. And it's this concept of T-shaped employees. So has everyone heard of IDEO? These guys, they're amazing design firm, just incredibly innovative. And what they invented, like the old Mac Plus boxes and the really cool boxes when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, all these really amazing designs, all over different types of products, software and hardware. And they believe it's always been at the heart of their organization. So the shape of the ideal information worker has wide knowledge. Maybe they have that deep engineering knowledge, but they also have more breadth. And what we see is this typical approach is where everybody is working very siloed. And organizations have gotten really good at silos, right? They believe, okay, that's the best way to drive a real profitable organization, create these different business units. Each one has a profit and loss unit, and they don't have to play together as long as they're profitable within their unit. But we believe in order to create new software experiences, you have to bring all of this together. And so what you want to look for is T-shaped employees. And maybe that presentation layer engineer is not the best creative and user experience designer, but they can help fill in the gaps. They can help drive the process. And by doing that, you can avoid queues. You can avoid these backups on the highway. And really, it's a belief in this concept of the T-shaped employee. And it's the belief that training and maybe maybe it takes them a little longer to make a change to the CMS or to the search product, but you have to believe that you can make that possible. Otherwise, you see it. And sprint planning is really one of the biggest times I've seen it on teams. Is I have a 10-person, 11-person cross-functional team, but only 3 guys can make presentation layer coding changes. And as an architect and a Scrum Master, it would always drive me kind of crazy when you'd raise the issue. Okay, we have this bug here, and the presentation layer engineer would say, I can't fix it because it's a back-end problem. And the back-end guy would say, I can't fix it because it's a front-end problem. And so it's just a horrible approach. And so you could see how breaking this concept of queues, driving cross-functional employees is really a way to fix that. We've talked a lot about this already. I think there's got to be a way to celebrate the product owner in a really strong way. We're not doing enough of that. And that means helping the organization make the change from I'm a manager of the ERP to I'm a manager of something that's important to a customer. Because what makes a product owner special is they understand features, they understand customer needs and wants, and it's a really hard thing to do. And they have to be a T-shaped employee, and we need to figure out ways to celebrate their role in this process. And so I think we're late to it, which is okay. We're learning, and again, the beauty of it. I've been recommending the Scrum Alliance course for a couple of years now, but it's only 2 or 3 years old. But as soon as it came out, all of our practitioners were like, this is fantastic. This is, again, when we would get our Agile teams together and the leaders across Razorfish, this was easily the #1 problem, was that there was no product owner. There wasn't someone who could make the priority trade-offs. And so you'd get to the end of the project, and the customer or the manager would expect everything was there. And that's just a waste of money, a waste of time, and you had teams building things they shouldn't build. Yes. Yeah.
So we have a problem whereby the person who makes the decisions and maybe has the knowledge of the real business is not someone who finds it easy to relate to the teams that are actually making the work. Maybe
Yep.
they don't understand any of the technical.
Yeah. Yeah.
So therefore, you edge towards having someone who understands a little bit more about the technical needs, but less about the business side.
Yeah.
Now, although you can have as many T-shaped people as you want, someone needs to really understand the decisions that they're making.
Yep.
How can you go towards bringing those, I don't know, 10 people together?
Yeah.
Or do you
Yeah, I haven't seen the solve it as a committee thing work, right? And that's why I keep going back to the course. Some of this can be trained, right? Like helping a new product owner understand, that's why, again, I think Rob's kickoff was great today, understand technology debt, right? That's really where I see it fall down time and time again, is the product owner doesn't understand technology debt or refactoring, and so they continue to prioritize features while the foundation is still loose. I read a great article the other day, and when you think about some of the world's greatest product owners, like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, others, they started as technologists. So I read this really great argument just last week. It was a good article on maybe product owners have to be technical, right? And maybe, you know, and again, it's the argument I've been making all day today, is that these solutions to driving softwares, as technology disrupts every area of every business, right? Like it feels like in the early days, oh, MP3s are disrupting the music and entertainment industry, or, you know, web's disrupting media. So it's like slowly we've realized, now we're starting to see in the States how much the web is disrupting retail. So technology is disrupting every industry, right? And there's fewer and fewer corners to hide, especially as we see things like 3D printing and Arduino come together. Like I said, now everything physical is going to be digital and on the internet. No one's going to be able to hide. And at that point, it needs to be a key element of it. And so I think there's a strong argument to be made that product owners need to have a technical background. And then that'll give them that ability to make those tough decisions and help to prioritize better. Because the product owners that don't have that grasp, who don't understand refactoring and technology debt, or those, you know, there's a lot of tech-facing, I don't know if you guys do this too, but just about every sprint team I've been involved with, there are tech stories, right? I need to refactor this, I need to build logging, I need to build my system administration elements, stuff like that. And if a product owner can't prioritize those, then I don't see how that team's going to be successful. And then that means that technologists need to understand and grow those other skills, right? And those are really, really tough skills. But when you look at all the amazing products that have been built, it started with some sort of technology product owner. It's a good argument. It's a great question, and that article I read really kind of made me rethink it, because I used to think, oh no, it can't be. It's got to be a creative. It's got to be a user experience person. But no, I don't think that's going to work unless, you know, they start to build those skills. So there's a great group here that started here in London called Decoded. Has anyone heard of Decoded? So they have a one-day course for creative directors at ad agencies to learn how to code. And at the end of the day, they're writing, it is presentation layer code, right? Like, so us old school guys will say, well, that's lightweight technology, right? It's HTML, JavaScript. Don't let any presentation layer guys hear me say that. But at the end of the day, they have a full-built work site. And I'm starting to see that change. And so, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to, you know, like a lot of us studied computer science or electrical engineer and been writing code for 10, 15 years, but it does mean you have to learn that. But that argument was really strong that maybe it has to be a technologist. So I have 10 more minutes. I do want to close up with one of my favorite and most exciting topics in our industry, and this is the cloud and DevOps. I stole this from a Flickr deck. So let's start with the application architect, right? The software architect. Yes, we're all a little bit weird. We sit closer to the boss, right? Like, because we want to make sure we understand the business. I can't do the right, and you think hard, right? Because you want to build an architecture that accounts for every dependency. Anything breaks, my architecture has thought about it, right? And that's Spock. But then there's Scotty, right? There's the guy who has to keep the nuclear reactions going and has to drive the levers and knobs. Easily excited, right? Because I do a production release and the whole site's out, and he's the guy who's getting yelled at. It's not Spock, right? I don't care if your architecture was right or not. It could have been wrong, but when the site's out, you talk to the operations guy, the guys who hold the infrastructure. And yes, he yells a lot in emergencies. But there's a way out of this, and this again this is what DevOps is about, which is bringing together, and there was a question earlier this morning on it too. It's bringing together software and production in a way. And I think the only way that happens, and the only reason we're having the DevOps conversations is because of cloud technologies, right? So that concept of a software-enabled architecture. So I spend a lot of time with AWS. I've worked a lot with the Google Cloud Engine and Cloud Compute. And they all talk about auto-scaling, right? Like, they think that's the biggest selling feature. And I think auto-scaling is interesting. Right? Like the Google guys will tell you, oh, we scaled to the biggest event in world history. It was the Royal Kiss, if anybody knows that. Like when the royal family, the recent wedding happened, that kiss was like huge. And that was all running on Google's cloud. But I think that's interesting, but we're not building sites that need that. What I do think is amazing is self-healing and the ability to spin up a couple different infrastructures. So what I mean by that is Amazon does a great job of this with their Elastic Load Balancer. The Elastic Load Balancer knows if one of your virtual instances is dead, and it starts it back up for you, right? So one less call to Scotty to fix your infrastructure. And what that enables is software-enabled infrastructure, and that allows you to harden it to create scripts, and I'll talk about how to do that. And these two guys come together, right? These guys who've always hated each other, right? Because the ops guys never liked the app guys, because the app guys would push out code that would break shit. They didn't know how to fix it, and they'd have to restart everything. So they hate each other. I know. I was an ops guy at one point. I know what it's like. I hated the apps guys. And of course, you drive cost alignment, and innovation is happening on top of the cloud. It's not happening on your private data center or your co-location provider. Nobody's building amazing stuff like this that happens in your infrastructure. So, and here's an example of some we've recently built, I've been part of, to build a CQ5, CMS, OSGI, JCR compliant instance. So CloudFormation is an Amazon capability to basically script out the instances you're creating, right? And maybe I'm creating a Linux instance, setting up an Elastic Load Balancer, et cetera. So you create that instance through CloudFormation, and then you install Opscode Chef, or that Chef client. Does anybody know what Chef is? Chef and Puppet? No one's heard of Chef and Puppet? I'm really glad I snuck this in the presentation. Chef and Puppet is amazing, right? And so Chef and Puppet are two different products. Opscode Chef is the example I used in this recent case. What it does is it creates, I like the theme they've done. So Chef client, it's a process running on my Linux or Windows Server or whatever, and I create a series of recipes within the Chef client. And so when I install the Chef client, I kick off the recipes to install all of the other components. So I'm installing Yum and Nginx, Build Essential. I install Adobe CQ5, Experience Manager, all of these different products, all pulled from this repository. And then what happens is this client is now registered with this repository. And this is all scripted, right? In the old days, we used to, copy over files, run shell scripts, do all this. None of that happens. Chef automates all of that. So this is all one script that's happening. And the reason why I made a distinction between CloudFormation and Chef is it allows us to stay vendor agnostic to some degree. Amazon's really further ahead than Microsoft, Google are kind of close, but not really. And now all the Chef stuff can be run on any cloud provider, and CloudFormation is the only thing that's specific to AWS. So now I've installed all of these things. Now a patch comes out for Nginx, the Chef repo, I should have put that in the diagram, out here in the cloud, that knows that everybody who has this Nginx server needs to get the latest patch. Patch gets pushed out, and you're good to go. So it's just amazing now that all of this can be brought together. And if you think about why that's powerful, is now when I do a release, everything is scripted. And what I can do, so what the DevOps guys do, and the rest of that, I stole that Spock and Scotty diagram from a Flickr presentation. I've actually talked to Etsy. Etsy's a commerce site in the States too that does this as well. They release code all day, every day, because all of this is scripted. So what they do is they have a production site, and then they have a new release, and it could be a small release. They spin up a whole new set of servers, which is just like the production site. And everything's done, everything's scripted. They can refresh the cache, make sure the CDN puts everything into cache, all of that. test it out on this full whole set of mirrored production environment, leave the old production, move the DNS to point to this new one, leave the old production infrastructure up, right? So if Scotty runs into trouble because all your application code broke production, they can shut the new code out and just roll back to the old one. And why that's powerful is that you couldn't do that with physical servers. If I had a bucket of physical servers, I can't have a separate production environment sitting around. So really powerful way, and I think this kind of shows that it's really all about that ability to have a software-enabled infrastructure. And Puppet is the competitor to Chef. Does pretty much the same thing. They just did a report on this, and the yellow's kind of hard to read. It's green on my screen. But people who are leveraging DevOps and are using technologies like Puppet and Chef are shipping code 30 times faster, and they complete the deployments 8,000 times. Have 50% fewer failures, and they restore service 12 times faster. The best example of where they brought this together is that Netflix has been a huge inspiration for me. So Netflix, on a nightly basis, is about, I just read, I tweeted this, so if anybody looks at my Twitter account, you'll see it. They get about 40% of all the internet traffic in the US on a nightly basis. So during prime time, right, evenings, and people aren't watching TV as much as, or traditional cable, so they're watching Netflix. So it's a massive, it's a huge set of servers. It's all running on AWS's cloud. They created this utility, and you could go to, I think they put it on GitHub, but you can get the source. It's all open source. It's called Chaos Monkey. Has anyone heard of Chaos Monkey? No. So what it does, infrastructure hardening. It goes through their infrastructure all day, every day, breaking things in production, right? So they're breaking shit all day, every day, and they're hardening that infrastructure. So the world that Scotty used to live in, where every time I pushed out a new piece of code, breaking something, and not practicing how to recover from that breakage, that's going away with cloud infrastructures. It's going away with the DevOps movement. And it's a welcome thing to go away, right? Like, so that you could see how we're not just building redundancy. So we've gone through these 5, keeping your team small, test, small batches, queues, embrace this future, because a lot of what Agile tries to do wasn't possible until there was cloud computing. It's right, like, until we had continuous build tools like Jenkins and Hutchins, et cetera, we couldn't do a lot of the principles of Agile. And so Agile's been held back with the lack of the crowd. So what you need is, you got to find your evangelists. I should get this tattoo one of these days. But somebody who's going to push through the friction that still that inertia in your organization. Why do you need to do it? And this is my Standish Group quote: 64% never gets used. And there's, I read this in an article last night about DARPA. And so DARPA's been around since Sputnik, right? So since Sputnik went into space, US created DARPA. And DARPA's created an amazing thing, right? Like, they created TCP/IP, the internet, 1969, like all these amazing things. And they've done it through small, iterative, agile teams. And this is a quote from DARPA. It was in a business review article I read on the plane over. So create diverse, agile, scalable teams, allow independence from the mainstream organization in project selection and execution. And that's how they've been, just so many amazing innovations have come out of that team. So I thought it was a great quote. Here's some of the books I talked about. This is my book. We talked a lot about the Agile piece. The first half of the book, we talk about these mega trends and technology, how it's disrupting business. Second half of the book, I talk a lot about, okay, what do you need to do to change your organization? And it starts with an Agile iterative approach with an evangelist who's willing to push through the friction. So even when your boss tells you to stop talking about Agile, keep talking about Agile. This is an old one by Fred Brooks, the Mythical Man Month. Shows a lot of the famous quote that, I don't know if it was in this book, but every time I use it, I reference it. Nine women can't make a baby in 1 month. That was inspired by that. This is relatively recent. Eric Ries is a startup, an entrepreneur in the States. And what he did is he took the Agile software development principles he learned and applied that to running a business. And so the power of small batches, testing before your iteration. And then this one, is the biggest takeaway I've gotten from scaling lean and Agile is eliminate queues, right? Train people, and how to scale, right? Because we all know the 2 pizza team thing. but the diagrams I showed earlier were from that book, which is how do you scale it. Cool. Any other questions before we wrap up? One more question, and you get a free copy of my book. It's got to be a good question now. All right, you got it.
Helping with a project. So my company, Disciplinary, won a lot of work with government.
Okay.
This year. We have a successful agile work going on, a couple of sprint teams. We're getting to the point where we can't send any more employees over to work. We have to work in Belfast to keep the team grow. So I was wondering, could you relate any of your real life experiences you had with working with teams on different sites?
Yeah.
Or any of the lessons you learned?
Yeah. So the question is, what are some of the lessons we have learned when working with distributed teams? And we're getting to the point where distributed teams are the norm for us. Not just, I think the industry is growing fast enough, but not just for cost advantages, but more than anything else, scale advantages. Being able to find talent in the same place, and you see it, right? That's why so many large cities I know they're all trying to recreate a culture that attracts the talent, so that this innovation can happen. And there's a reason, right? Because the talent's everywhere, and I think it's always going to be everywhere. And with the maker movement, it's going to get even worse, right? We're going to be building more and more software in every part of our lives. And so distributed teams is the norm. One of the biggest learnings we've seen is embracing the tools and getting teams comfortable with the tools, finding as much time zone overlap, right? Like, so even if there are 2 different time zones, have people try to figure out ways to shift their working schedule. And whenever we work with India, the teams could come in at close to noon. I worry about it a little because it's kind of hard with a family to do that, but that's the reality of the best way to do it. So then in terms of embracing tools is use as many of the communication tools as you can, right? Like so drive more usage of instant messaging, drive more usage of conference call and video conferencing. Video conferencing, there's a lot of good stats behind it, very impactful. Even if it's an ad hoc Google Hangout or Skype conference that drive that. We use the Skype ability to share my screen while I'm on a call with people. These have huge impacts. And a couple of the first projects we did where we had our team in Argentina and our team in the States, the first 3 sprints was every sprint, what's the one thing we can fix to help our team work better together? And it was call quality and video conference quality. And so those are the biggest ones. And then it's what we see is collaborating around a living tool set. So there's lots of great tools like Jenkins and Hudson, et cetera, driving continuous integration. So anytime anyone checks in a piece of code, regardless of where they sit, it kicks off a build, puts it to a staging server, and you know immediately who broke the build, who didn't break the build, and getting it addressed. So tools like that. And then there's also collaboration documentation tools. So what we see most commonly, like the hands down winningest tool for software development teams is the Atlassian suite. So the Confluence Wiki, Jira, Greenhopper, and getting them all up on a screen during sprint planning with everybody on a video conference in the same room. That huge impact. We didn't do that in the first couple of sprints when we were working with our teams in Argentina and San Jose, and it was the first things we would fix. So I think once you start bringing all of those together and try to pick 1 or 2 per sprint to address, then that makes a massive impact on that. And then the last thing I would do is get people in the same room. Right? Like make people travel. That's what we do when we start new teams that are really distributed. We force everybody to fly to the first location for at least 1 sprint and hopefully 2 or 3. It's a bit of a hardship, but sometimes, but that's the biggest #1 learning. Like forget everything else I said and forget all the technologies. Fly people into the same room for the first 3 sprints. Cool. All right, so I'm a little bit over, but any other questions? Okay, great. Thanks, everybody.